I feel like sometimes we can become resistant to becoming better, becoming more well, because we've gotten so used to being unwell that we don't recognize the version of ourselves that is well. One thing that I'll say for myself is that what pushed me to speak to my mom and tell her what I was going through is because from a young age, I've always been somebody who wants the best for myself. But even I fell into that trap of hyper-identifying with trauma. Welcome to Well with Jesus, where we do wellness Jesus way. This podcast is all about empowering you to build a wellness routine that honors God and makes you feel your best. Each week, I'll share practical tips and biblical principles to help you create a sustainable routine without the overwhelm, guilt, and spiritual confusion of many wellness trends. If that resonates with you, dear friend, I'd love for you to join me weekly. Don't forget to rate and review the show so more women can find us. Hello, dear friend, and welcome to another episode of the Well with Jesus podcast. Today, I want to talk about healing from emotional trauma and unsubscribing from victim mentality. So before we get into it, I want to start by reading Isaiah 43:18-19, which says, "Do not remember the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." I feel like this is a really great scripture that encapsulates this whole thing of not being stuck in past experiences and just allowing ourselves to perceive the move of God in our present and to come in our future. So this episode is inspired by my personal experience of emotional healing and having to overcome victim mentality, and I feel like it's a really needed discussion in the current culture that we're living in that is so aware of the importance of counseling, the importance of unpacking our traumas and doing the inner work to heal. But I feel just from my observations and interpretation of a lot of this messaging that there can be an overemphasis on focusing on our traumas and trying to understand everything that ever happened to us so that we can heal. I was actually listening to an episode from the Lisa Bevere podcast, and she was talking about basically what I want to talk about today. And she was talking about how if we are constantly trying to understand what happened to us in our past to finally heal, we're going to remain in that place of trying to understand what happened to us, trying to understand the events that led to where we find ourselves, like in our mental and emotional health, and we're not really going to be able to move forward. And leaning on God for healing is actually the only source of help that we truly have. And in saying that, I'm not discounting going to therapy and doing self-work. I've done all of those things, and I actually am quite an advocate. But in my experience of being in therapy, it can sometimes make you just dwell for too long in those past events and actually hinder you from moving forward, and actually also in a way encourage you to stay in a place of woe is me because of the things that I've gone through. I thought that I would also briefly, without going into too much detail, share my experiences of kind of having a mental health breakdown and how I healed and the lessons that I learned. I just want this to be a really laid back episode, hopefully, where it's kind of just like story time, as though we were talking to each other face to face. So going back to first year, second year university, 2016 was kind of like the beginning of or not the beginning, right, because it started before, but it was kind of like the peak of the Fees Must Fall movement and the student housing crisis and all of that stuff. And when I got to campus, I kind of found myself also without accommodation, and it was a really stressful situation. And there was a protest going on that day, particularly for students who didn't have accommodation. And so when I was at whatever that building is called, I can't remember, it's been so long since I was in university, but on Middle Campus, where you go to sort out things like this, I was there, and the protest passed by there and just encouraged all of the students who were struggling to come with them, and they would give them help and all of that. So I did. I left my parents and I was like, okay, see you guys later. I'll keep you guys updated. I went with them and spent the day going from res to res, just in this protest. And as a first year student, it was somewhat exciting until I got to the end of the day and we were in this, I don't know, what felt like a backpacking hostel kind of thing, and I just totally broke down. I think the stress of driving 14 hours from Gauteng to the Western Cape, only to get there to have to deal with university officials and a whole entire protest, was just a lot for 18-year-old me to handle. And so I had a breakdown, and that was the beginning of my university experience. That set the tone for those first 2 years of uni. As you can imagine, that's not really a great starting note for something that's meant to be such an exciting experience. And so for the rest of that year, I found myself just in this emotional funk. Like I self-diagnosed myself as being depressed. And earlier in my life, when I was younger, going through some difficult family dynamics, I went through some time where I also self-diagnosed myself as depressed. I'm just chuckling because I'm listening to myself speak and I'm like, that's so redundant, self-diagnosed myself. But anyway, yeah, so I guess I had enough experience with feeling so not okay that I could identify that, you're probably low-key depressed. And throughout my life, I developed unhealthy emotional coping responses. And the main one was that I just would repress my feelings. So I got really, really good at doing that. When something challenging would happen that either I didn't want to deal with or I just did not have the emotional toolkit to deal with it, I would just shove those feelings down. And you can imagine how many years of unaddressed emotions and traumatic situations would have also accumulated and built up and mixed up with that experience that I had when I got to university. So throughout that year, I was dealing with the emotional after effects of how stressful it was when I got to university. And obviously I was living off campus when things finally got resolved. I felt so isolated, like people are on campus having a great time, making friends, but I just was not having that experience. And I wasn't upset because I wasn't having that experience, because I had already been in boarding school. So I knew what it was like to live with your friends 24/7, and I was like, no, thank you. I want a bit more independence. So it's not that I was upset because I felt like I wasn't having the kind of experience that I should have been having. I was more so just not coping with the extreme isolation of living by yourself in university. And I did have a flatmate, but we weren't really like very good friends, and we never got to that point of being very good friends. We were acquaintances, but we didn't really know each other very well. And she was also going through her own things because she also basically had the same experience as me, and that's why we ended up living together. So first year was just me going through the most of trying to past, course was hectic, but also emotionally, I was just not okay. And because I didn't deal with things, I just put my emotions as far back in my mind as I could, and I didn't really talk to anybody about my experiences. It just kept getting worse. It just got worse and worse as the year progressed. And then in second year, it got even worse. Like, can worse get worse? Definitely. So second year, I just eventually felt like, I can't cope anymore. I just remember feeling like I just can't go to class. I can't go to campus. I remember one time I was on the Jammy and I just was like, I need a day off. Like, I think once a week, I'm just not going to go to campus. Like, I'll study from home. And once I got into that rhythm, I remember some of those days I would just stay home in bed and watch series the whole day. I'd wake up in the morning, scroll on X, which was Twitter at the time, and it was also, I felt a bit dark there. It would impact me so much so that when I finished my session on X, I'd be feeling heavier, Anyway, so those were my first 2 years, and eventually I got to a point where I felt like I can't go on anymore. Like, I'm not going to do anything to myself, but I actually cannot go on like this anymore. If I don't make a change, I don't think I'm gonna make it. So that pushed me to speak to my mom and just say, "Hore Miguel, I'm not okay. I get sharp. I need help." So I spoke to my mom, and my mom is just loving, amazing, and so she set me up, and I found myself a therapist. I was looking for somebody, like a brown woman, somebody who I felt like I could relate to. And I found her and I started going to therapy, and over time it really started helping. I could feel the effects of talking about things that I never really spoke about, that I should have spoken about, and having somebody hold my hand through walking through how those experiences impacted me and how they are actually continuing to impact me in the present day. And so in the beginning, it was so necessary. Like, if I didn't go to therapy, I don't know where I'd be today. I believe that I'd be okay because God is for me and he made a way to find me, or rather for me to find him. But yeah, I just can't envision, like, from my human mind, how things would have gone for me if I did not spend those months in counseling. And so in that time, I started to just face myself and confess to myself that the way that I've been going about things is not healthy, and I need to make a change. I need to change my ways. I need to start opening up to my mom more and doing that consistently. And yeah, that started me doing just inner work. I started doing things like journaling and just being really conscious of how situations make me feel, how I react in stressful or traumatic circumstances. However, over time, I started to realize that, okay, I don't really have that much to talk about anymore. And I feel like continuing to come here and just talk about things from the past is not really serving me so much anymore. So I feel like I got to a point where it just was having diminishing returns. So fast forward a few years, it was during the pandemic and I was living alone. And I was experiencing extreme loneliness, like hectic loneliness. I would have breakdowns every now and then just from the pain of being alone. And I'm an introvert. I actually quite enjoy being by myself. But I realized in that time that whenever I am alone and enjoying it, it's usually like I'm at home. I'm in my bedroom. I know that my mom's in the house. I know that my sister's in the house. So I'm not actually literally alone. I'm just in my own space and enjoying my own company. But being by yourself 24/7 without any escape was extremely overwhelming for me. And yes, I was in a much better place in my life in terms of my mental and emotional health, but that really was a very difficult time for me as well. Nothing in comparison to the depression, but it was really hard as well. I went back to therapy. I had to find a new therapist because now I was back in Joburg, and for the first few sessions, it definitely was quite beneficial. But again, I found myself at the point where I was like, this is not really helping anymore. I feel like I don't need to keep coming. And something that I observed was that talking about things from the past, which is generally what you do in therapy, was keeping me in a way attached to the things that happened to me in the past. I feel as though just doing that week after week for such a long time, past the point of where I was getting, the healing benefits from it that I experienced in those first few months, it was just cultivating in me a mindset of looking at myself and looking at the events that happened to me, even in the present day, through this filter of the traumas that I've gone through. So it created in me a sort of identity of being somebody who's gone through hard things, somebody who's gone through depression, somebody who's gone through social anxiety. And I had a childhood friend of mine, who was also going through some hard things and having to go through therapy and stuff like that, roughly at the same time as me. And so we would kind of just like talk about our experiences together and what we were learning and observing and stuff. And she also had the same feeling of, I feel like I'm just kind of like stuck in the past and over identifying with things that have happened to me in the past. I feel as though what we went through, me and my friend, is not a unique experience, especially like I was saying in the beginning of this episode, just living in a world where we are so aware of trauma, little t trauma, big T trauma. We are so aware of how we need to process these kinds of things and the effects of not processing it. But I also feel like there's a level of self-indulgence where we take it to the extreme, where somebody can do something that offends you, and every time something like that happens, you're talking about how you're triggered. It's triggering something that happened to you when you were 10 years old. Or every time you do something that offends somebody else, and that person is like valid in having a claim against you, I guess, you excuse all of your bad behavior by the traumas that you went through. And so I feel like that's the part that is problematic and that holds us back from moving forward, that holds us back from actually experiencing true and long-lasting healing. When I started recovering from depression and social anxiety, I was traumatized by going through depression. Like, I was so scared that it would come back and that I would have to go through that again. And I feel like in that period where I was recovering from the trauma of depression, I was in a way still holding on to that painful experience that I went through. I had healed a lot from the experiences that led me to the depression, but then I was still kind of identifying a lot with the depression and with the anxiety. And that in itself was kind of holding me back from moving forward. I can't remember exactly when it was that I no longer had that fear anymore, but when I didn't have the fear of depression, anxiety coming back is when I was fully able to recover and just be able to let go of that experience and live in the now, like enjoy having good mental health, being able to deal properly with my emotions. And so from that personal experience, I had a moment of awakening, I guess I could say, realizing that the more tightly I hold on to the hard things that have happened to me, actually, the more I'm holding myself back from experiencing true healing. And that is what I believe this scripture in Isaiah is speaking to, right? I know that there is a context of the scripture that isn't about healing from emotional trauma necessarily, but I feel as though it is relevant into this conversation where God is saying to us, behold, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? How can we perceive the new thing? How can we perceive the healing, the soundness of mind that is spoken of in the book of Timothy if we are holding on to the things of old? So this really is an encouragement to us, people who have gone through hard things, which is a lot of people, to, yes, do the work, go to counseling, do the journaling, do all of those things, but do those things looking forward to when the weight of those experiences isn't weighing you down so heavily anymore. And also be willing to accept a new version of yourself, right? The version of you that is healed. And even in me saying healed, I don't mean like perfect healing, because we're always going to go through difficult things. And as believers, we know that that perfect healing actually comes when the full redemption arc of humanity is completed after the second coming of Christ. That's when we have our full hope and promise of being fully healed, not having any more wounds and pain and all of that stuff. But in our today, we need to be willing to accept the new version of ourselves that isn't so wounded, the one that has the scars, and scars are symbolic of healing, right? Because when a wound heals, it becomes a scar. But even if we have these scars from things that have happened to us, we shouldn't wear them as battle scars. We shouldn't necessarily be so proud to parade the scars of our emotional traumas, because then we're still identifying and defining ourselves by those things. Rather, we should be willing to accept the version of ourselves that is in a much better headspace, because that indicates that we have actually really moved forward and we are actually leaning into joy, peace, etc. I feel like sometimes we can become resistant to becoming better, becoming more well, because we've gotten so used to being unwell that we don't recognize the version of ourselves that is well. One thing that I'll say for myself is that what pushed me to speak to my mom and tell her what I was going through is because from a young age, I've always been somebody who wants the best for myself. But even I fell into that trap of hyper identifying with trauma. That's something that we should be mindful of, and we shouldn't be so willing to let these shackles bind us into our future and rob us of the experiences and the works that God is doing in our lives to give us a new future, a new hope, right? He speaks about that in one of the most commonly quoted verses of the Bible, Jeremiah 29:11, that I know the plans that I have for you to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. We like to quote that verse, but how can we actually receive that future and hope if we're not willing to let go of the former things that the Lord is telling us to let go of in Isaiah 43:18-19? So whoever you are listening to this, if you have been going through difficult things, if you are working through traumatic things that you've been through, you fully have permission to work through those things and get the help that you need. And also, you don't need my permission. It's not me giving you permission, but I'm saying in general. But beyond that, once you've gotten through that phase, allow yourself to rest in your healing. Allow yourself to rest in your better mental health, your better emotional health. Make space for God to do the new thing. So that's what I wanted to chat about today. I hope that I've been able to express myself in a way that is clear so you get what I was trying to share today. I didn't really draft a lot of bullet points to talk on today. Like I said, I just wanted it to be kind of just story time. So I hope it wasn't all over the place. But I think I have gotten my point across, and I hope that this really just speaks to someone who has been in a place of a victim mentality. Let's make a commitment collectively to unsubscribe from victim mentality. It's not your friend. It's not going to get you where you want to be. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I pray that it blesses you and equips you to create the change that you're looking for in your life. Stay in touch on social media. It's at Well With Jesus Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and Pinterest. And share something from today's episode on your story. Maybe it's a quote, a screenshot, or whatever it may be. I'd just love to see what's resonating with you. It'll also help the show grow and reach more women like yourself. All the resources from today's episode will be in the podcast description below, so make sure to check that out. And until next week, dear friend, stay well with Jesus.